Hey everybody, welcome to another multi-game My Thoughts On video, where I go over a bunch of games that I don't really have all that much to say about individually, so I bundle them all into the same video. In this particular case, I have 5 more first-person shooters, and I am titling this video For a Few First-Person Shooters More, because the last video I did of this type was a fistful of first-person shooters, and I'm a Western nerd, so just deal with it. As per usual, I'm going to go ahead and take a look at these games in alphabetical order, and they are going to be Alien Rage, Bright Memory, Mothergunship, Raid World War II, and Unloved. And of course, we're going to be starting with Alien Rage. Alien Rage is a first-person shooter by CI Games that was released in 2013 for PC, Xbox 360, and PlayStation 3. Of course, what you're seeing here is the PC version. And it was generally pretty poorly received, with a lot of complaints being directed at it being fairly generic and having a lot of glitches, especially on the consoles, where apparently it ran like absolute garbage. And even the PC version had some technical problems that it doesn't seem like they've ironed out. I mean, this game will regularly dip into very low frame rates for no discernible reason, which is particularly frustrating considering that I am running an i7 4790K, 16 gigs of RAM, and a GTX 1080, a system that should absolutely demolish Unreal Engine 3 games. And yet Alien Rage seems to think that running below 30 frames per second at complete random is perfectly acceptable when it is definitely not. Especially for a first-person shooter like this, which takes place primarily in some fairly cramped environments that are all very linear. I mean, sure, the visual quality's pretty good for a game developed on Unreal Engine 3 by Polish developers working with a fairly small budget, but that's not really an excuse for the poor performance, and more importantly, the solid modeling and texture work is marred by the fact that pretty much everything in this game is a shade of gray unless it's a fluorescent orange or a blue light, and while the ridiculous amount of particle effects you'll be seeing look pretty good, unfortunately a lot of the time they just get in your way and make it hard to see exactly what you're trying to do. And once you get past all of that, you're playing a first-person shooter where you play as a guy named Jack who's gone to a mining facility on an asteroid where aliens known as the Vorus have taken over the mining facility and are using it to mine the promethium that the humans were also mining. It's this incredibly powerful source of energy, and Jack is just going in there to wipe out all the aliens and destroy the facility. It's a very bland and generic setup for a sci-fi first-person shooter, and it doesn't really do much for the game, so once you get past that, you're really looking at the gameplay being the main draw. And the gameplay is also a rather generic sci-fi first-person shooter, and mechanically is basically every other first-person shooter from the era, where you got a 2-weapon limit, with regenerating health and an aim-down sight mechanic, and the only thing they really do to try to differentiate it from other first-person shooters is they tack on a score system, where getting kills in different manners will result in you getting more points, and the more points you get, the more perks you're gonna unlock, and those perks make you more powerful, things like giving you additional health and such. So while you might be tempted to say, oh, it's Slavjank Bulletstorm, it's actually not particularly janky, and ironically enough, Bulletstorm was also made by Polish developers, and is frankly a lot more fun than this is. I mean, Alien Rage does make a few attempts at humor here and there, but they all fall completely flat, and it's certainly not the completely and utterly ridiculous, over-the-top nonsense that Bulletstorm was, which in itself is actually kind of infectious in that game. With Alien Rage, on the other hand, there's really not much reason to play it. It's like the developers made a really generic sci-fi first-person shooter, and Bulletstorm came out while they were developing it. They saw what that was doing, and they decided to copy a few elements from that, only it just comes across as a fairly half-assed attempt at doing so. And I don't think I'd go so far as to say Alien Rage is an outright terrible game, but it's certainly not a good one, or even really an average one. It's subpar at best, and there are a ton of other first-person shooters out there that are far more worth your time and money, so I really can't recommend it at all. Next up, we have Bright Memory, and this particular section of the video is coming to you courtesy of Yodastein, who sent me a copy of this, so thank you, it is greatly appreciated. And this is a first-person shooter developed by FYQD Personal Studio, and being published by Playism, and while this particular version of the game is no longer in early access, it was released into early access in January of last year, and the developer worked on it for a while before deciding to move on to making this into a full proper game that would be called Bright Memory Infinite and is still being developed, and we don't really know when it's going to come out. But the game did get a fair bit of attention for seemingly very high production values and being developed primarily by one person. In addition, it also got some attention for being a very different style of first-person shooter than what we're used to, because it plays a lot more like a game like Devil May Cry, where the idea is you have a bunch of different special abilities as well as melee attacks on top of being able to shoot things, and you're trying to build up a combo to better and better levels. You also have pretty high mobility, being able to do both a double jump as well as use a grapple and of course dash all around on the ground. This of course does mean that the combat is rather fast-paced and has potential for some really interesting high-level gameplay, although you don't really get that from the demo that's available right now. And it does also mean that Bright Memory doesn't really play like any other first-person shooter out there, at least not in its entirety. It's a weird mishmash of a lot of different ideas, and it actually does work pretty well. The combat loop is pretty fun in this. Although I will say that with what was available in this particular version of the game, the combat loop did get a bit tedious once it introduced the enemies that were particularly damage spongy, which really may not be all that surprising to you if you're more familiar with games like Devil May Cry or Bayonetta or something along those lines, because once those start introducing the damage spongy enemies, the combat can get pretty tedious in them too. Now of course this demo is short enough to where it doesn't really become that big of a problem, but it is something where you can see it might be an issue in the full game. It just depends on how it's handled. Similarly, I'm very curious how the non-combat portions are going to be handled in Infinite, because in this particular demo, they're pretty bare bones. There was some light puzzle solving and platforming in the demo, and while it was handled mostly fine in this, and there wasn't really anything to complain about there, I'm really curious how the full version of the game is going to handle the balance, if it's going to go more combat and less puzzle solving and platforming, or if it's going to go a bit more into the platforming and puzzle solving, or what they end up doing. Because regardless of how they handled this balance of combat and puzzle solving and platforming and such, it needs to be handled very carefully, otherwise you'll end up with some really nasty pacing issues. And because this is more of a proof of concept tech demo kind of thing, you don't really get an opportunity to see how the game would pace itself in a much bigger context, so we'll just have to wait and see how that turns out in the full version. After all, this is really more of a proof of concept and tech demo than anything else. It's not really meant to do anything other than give you a general idea of how the game plays, and of course, how the general style is going to be, and it does accomplish that, and if all of that is anything to go by, we might have a real gem on our hands with the full version. So I'll be keeping my eye on it, and when the full version's out, I'll definitely take another look at it. Next up is Mothergunship, which is a first-person shooter by Grip Digital and Terrible Posture Games that is advertised as a bullet hell first-person shooter, which is rather odd because bullet hell is something we typically associate with the scrolling shoot-'em-up genre with games like Ikaruga or Touhou. And the idea there is that you have a ridiculous number of projectiles on screen, which is going to make the game more difficult as you are constantly having to duck and weave around all these different projectiles. The thing is, while Mothergunship does have bullet hell elements, it's really more of a roguelite first-person shooter than anything else. You play as a soldier in a suit of powered armor that's going up against an armada of robotic aliens that have conquered Earth, and nearly everything in the game is procedurally generated, from the layouts of the rooms, which are all set from a bunch of templates, as well as the enemy placements and the sheer amount of enemies, and of course all of the different gun parts you get. Because the big draw of this game is, of course, the bullet hell, but also the fact that you craft your own guns with a selection of parts that consist of connectors, caps, and barrels, where the only restrictions you have are whether the part will physically fit where you've placed it, and, of course, that barrels have to be facing forward. The main function of each of your guns is going to be up to whatever barrels are attached, and you can have more than one selection of barrels on a particular gun, and you can get pretty ridiculous with the sheer amount of crap you can stick on a single gun. Although the more crap you put on a gun, the more energy it's going to cost to shoot it, and while you never really run out of energy, it does have a recharge time that you need to be aware of when you're shooting at things. There is no default gun to fall back on. Instead, you have fists that actually do quite a lot of damage, surprisingly enough. and whenever you build a gun, it's going to replace one of those fists, so you can have up to 2 guns at any time, but depending on which barrel attachments you use, as well as which caps you use, which also alter the effects of whatever the gun is, you can potentially end up with something that is ultimately very optimized to one particular thing. Like, say you have really decked out this railgun to be the most powerful railgun it can be, or you can just throw a bunch of random barrels onto a thing and suddenly you have a gun that actually has a rotary cannon as well as a railgun and a lightning gun, and it shoots lasers and it shoots rockets and all sorts of crazy things like that. Yeah, in case you can't tell, this game really doesn't take itself very seriously, and it is constantly cracking jokes at not only the forces of Earth for being incompetent on their own, but also the alien forces for also being somewhat incompetent. Unfortunately though, a lot of those jokes really aren't all that funny. At best, they might elicit a "huh," but nothing more than that, and when the game is trying to be as ridiculous as it is, that does end up wearing on you after a while. This means that a lot of the game ultimately falls to its gameplay, which is very roguelite in the sense that you are going into procedurally generated environments where you'll go into a room, the doors will lock, you'll fight a bunch of enemies, and then the doors will open, and you'll be able to continue on from there. True to the bullet hell inspirations, you will eventually start fighting a huge number of enemies all at once, and tons of projectiles and explosions will be on the screen all at once, which does certainly add some degree of challenge to the game, but unfortunately it also means that the performance tends to tank quite frequently. And that's pretty much the kiss of death for a bullet hell game, because if you've got all this stuff on screen that you are trying to avoid all at once and the performance has tanked considerably, then your ability to react to that and to dodge those projectiles is compromised not by your own inability, but by the game itself. This issue is only exacerbated by the roguelite mechanics, where the rooms themselves are randomly chosen from a selection of presets and the enemy layouts are likewise chosen. And of course, whatever random guns you've got may not necessarily be optimal for whatever you're going up against. Because the further you get into the game, the more health the enemies are going to have, meaning that you're going to require more and more damage output to be able to take them down, and if you've got guns that really aren't up to that task and you don't have the attachments to make them up to that task, then there's not really a whole lot you can do about it. This can bog the combat down and make it a tedious slog, which is especially disturbing because it was already happening only about an hour into the game. And with that trend only set to continue for the rest of the game, I really can't see myself finishing this thing at any point, and more importantly, I really can't recommend it. Once that novelty value of the weapon customization wears off, you're really not left with a whole lot of substance to this, and it just loses its appeal extremely quickly. Next up, we have Raid World War II, which this particular section of the video is coming to you courtesy of a viewer who prefers to remain anonymous, who sent me a copy of this to take a look at, so thank you for that, it is greatly appreciated. But this is a cooperative first-person shooter developed by Lion Game Lion and published by Starbreeze Studios, and it was released in 2017 for PC, Xbox One, and PlayStation 4, and it runs on the Diesel engine, which is the same engine that powers Payday 2, and in fact, you may look at this and go, wow, that looks an awful lot like Payday 2 with a World War II skin. And in a lot of ways, you would be right. It is a up to 4-person cooperative first-person shooter where you play as one of 4 characters conducting operations against the Germans during World War II, and you will be fighting waves upon waves of seemingly endless amounts of German soldiers. Along the way, you'll also have to complete various objectives, which usually involve destroying something or attacking a certain target or something along those lines, and the objectives generally are pretty uninspired and uninteresting, leaving you to go into these situations where you're just going to try to complete everything as quickly as you can. Despite the game throwing tons of enemies at you, and those enemies gradually getting tougher as you continue to go through the particular mission you're on, and getting more varied enemy types like flamethrower troopers, for example, there's never really much in the way of legitimate challenge because the enemy AI is dumber than a sack of hammers, which is okay in single player because the friendly AI is also dumber than a sack of hammers, but in co-op it makes things trivially easy. Although good luck getting into a co-op game because for the past 2 years, this game has mostly had single-digit player counts. And that's really not all that surprising. The game is notorious for being extremely buggy and crash-prone, although they did sort out a lot of those issues with patches over time. And the general gameplay loop is an extremely tedious, grindy slog, where you have 4 player classes, each of which levels up individually, and you have to set up a character with those classes in order to be able to do anything with them. And you very slowly will unlock new weapons and equipment over time, all of which can be upgraded over time, but it takes so much grinding that you're not going to want to do it. I mean, to give you a prime example, the first damage upgrade you can get for the M1 carbine requires 500 kills with the damn thing. And for your starter pistol, the C96, it takes 250 kills to upgrade the damage the first time. And the costs only go up as you continue to unlock the new tiers. And you'd think if they made the grinding so ridiculous with those that the upgrades would be really substantial, but they're not. It's maybe a couple of rounds of extra capacity, or maybe a few more points of damage, but it's never anything substantial, and it makes the grind not even remotely worth it. And that continues when you look at the various class upgrades that you'll unlock over time, because they're all just small incremental improvements to certain stats, and they never really have anything substantial to them either. So the core gameplay is an incredibly tedious slog where the rewards are not even remotely worth completing that tedious slog, and between that pathetic excuse of a gameplay loop and the very weak visuals, which feature a ton of pop-in and are just downright ugly to look at, you can't help but wonder how much of the development budget was just wasted on the absolutely pathetic FMV cutscenes, which occasionally feature John Cleese just saying, "Oh look, we've got a new mission for you," but usually feature somebody dressed up as Adolf Hitler in a war room going, "Nine!" Because, I don't know, I guess the developers really like Inglourious Bastards and want to remind you every few moments. But obviously all that wasn't enough to keep people interested in the game, because it's dead now, and for very good reason. Raid World War II is outright trash, and you should avoid it entirely. And last up for this particular video, we have Unloved, which is by Blue Eagle Productions, aka Paul Schneider. And according to the Steam page, this is a reimagining of the Doom 2 mod that also was made by Paul Schneider, and it's meant to bring that into Unreal Engine 4. Except I'm not really sure what it's reimagining, because this plays nothing at all like the mod. You see, the Unloved mod was actually a relatively short campaign where you went through a very atmospheric set of Doom maps, and it was really meant to be more of a horror vibe than anything else. This, on the other hand, is a roguelite first-person shooter with a lot of procedural generation in regards to things like the level layouts and the enemies that you're going to be going up against, as well as the items that you'll find in the various levels, and even whatever objectives you're trying to complete. And that should immediately raise some red flags, because when you've got that much of the game being procedurally generated, chances are you have a game that is very low on depth, and that is exactly the case with Unloved. It has basically no depth at all. It's a wave-based first-person shooter that is intended to be played in co-op. You wander around the procedurally generated levels, you blast anything that gets in your way, and you are ultimately trying to complete some randomly chosen objectives, which usually just have you going up to something and holding the use key for a period of time. In fact, you'll be doing an awful lot of holding the use key, because the default mode of play has the hold to interact enabled, which means that you'll be going up to all the different objects and all the different item pickups, and you'll have to hold the use button down to be able to pick it up. Now, obviously, for most games these days, that's the norm, so you're probably not going to think that's a big problem, but it is a wave-based first-person shooter, so you'll be doing these things in the middle of when enemies are attacking you all at once. And so you'll have to stop whatever it is you're doing and take care of the enemies and go back to it, unless of course you're playing co-op, in which case somebody can cover you while you're doing it. And since the player counts for this are in the single digits, you're pretty much not going to be playing co-op unless you deliberately organize something with a group of friends. And that's probably not going to be the easiest thing to do, considering how this game looks. It's not just that the graphics look extremely amateurish at absolute best, it's that everything is extremely dark, and a lot of the things that aren't dark make it pretty hard on your eyes. The screen just ends up becoming something of a mess of effects, and it just gives you a headache after a while. And once you get past the first impressions, all you've got here is an extremely simplistic wave-based first-person shooter where you're just going through these randomly generated mazes where all of the areas look almost the same, and all of the enemies just walk straight towards you, and if they have ranged attacks, they'll shoot at you, but if they don't have ranged attacks, they'll just go right up to you and start whacking you in the face, and you're just going to have to mow them all down, most of which go down extremely easily, in fact. And while there are are a selection of objectives available, as well as a selection of enemies that you'll be fighting, each of which has their own strengths and weaknesses and capabilities and such. Unfortunately, the game just does such a poor job explaining any of it that whenever you go into a level, which is of course procedurally generated, you're going to have absolutely no idea where you need to go or what you need to do. So whenever you start a mission, you're just going to wander around aimlessly, shooting anything that moves, picking up whatever you can find, and then eventually you'll find whatever the objective is you need to complete, and then once you've completed that, then the game will tell you to get back to the elevator, and once you've done that, congratulations, you've won. It gets extremely dull and repetitive extremely quickly, and when you compare it to the original Unloved Doom mod, you wonder if it was even remotely the same developer, because the original Doom mod is actually rather good. It was pretty carefully constructed and clearly had some expertise put into it. This, on the other hand, is so bare bones and simplistic, you can't help but wonder if this is actually a pre-alpha masquerading as a fully released game. But unfortunately, it is a finished game, and I cannot remotely recommend it. Especially when there's just so many far better options for cooperative first-person shooters out there, like, say, Killing Floor, for example. So I'd say that while you might want to check out the Doom mod that this is very, very loosely based on, there's definitely no reason to pick up the standalone Unreal Engine 4 Unloved. So there you have it, folks, my thoughts on a few more first-person shooters. I've got more first-person shooters like this, although I'm not really sure what I'm going to call the next video of this type, so if you have suggestions for it, then feel free to leave those in the comments. Because the next film in the Man with No Name trilogy is The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, and while that is actually my personal favorite of those three, unfortunately it doesn't really lend itself all that well to being turned into a play on first-person shooters, so probably gonna have to skip over that one in favor of other plays on first-person shooters, but anyway, I hope you enjoyed this particular video, and if you like the kind of videos I make, then please consider supporting the channel on Patreon. All of the revenue from that goes directly back into the channel, whether that be getting additional equipment, or additional games for review, or replacing equipment that is broken, or whatever the case may be. If you can't afford to contribute to the Patreon, or don't want to, that's perfectly fine, I understand. But the option is there if you're interested. Thanks again for watching, and I will see you all in later videos.